Well, in my closing statement, let me try to draw together some of the threads of the debate this evening. First, I've tried to establish that there are 4 facts about the historical Jesus that any adequate historical hypothesis has to account for. First, the burial. Now, we both agree with the historicity of the burial of Jesus. The whole dispute comes down as to the significance of the burial for the belief in Jesus' resurrection. And Dr. Lüdemann didn't answer my point that it doesn't matter how long after it was the disciples began to preach, as long as there was a decaying corpse in that occupied tomb that would silence belief in the resurrection. But he responded, we don't know the relationship of the corpse to the resurrection body. Well, I think that's simply false. In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul makes it very clear that the spiritual body is the transformation of the body that is sown, that is buried in the ground. Thus, he uses the pronoun it 4 times. It is sown in weakness. It is raised in power. He uses the pronoun this 4 times. This perishable nature must put on the imperishable. So that Paul is saying there is historical and numerical continuity between the body that is interred in the ground and that is raised to new spiritual life. So if the disciples were faced with an occupied tomb in Jerusalem, as we both admit, then this would have silenced belief in the resurrection. Secondly, what about their belief in the empty tomb? I gave 5 lines of evidence for the empty tomb, and in his last speech, Dr. Ludemann finally deals with the question of the simplicity of the account. He says it's not really so simple after all, because the young man in the tomb is Mark himself. Well, now the word there, neanaskos, for young man, is used traditionally of angels in other sources. I think there's no reason to doubt that this is meant to be an angelic figure. But more importantly, I think, the women's silence that Mark is talking about here, I don't think was meant to be permanent. He means they didn't tell anybody along the way as they went to find the other disciples. They didn't speak to anyone because they were afraid. An excellent paper by Larry Hurtado was given this last November at the AARSBL meeting, Society of Biblical Literature, making precisely this point on the women's silence. It's incredible to think that Dr. Ludemann could be correct, that nobody for 40 years would ask about where the grave of Jesus is until Mark says, oh, well, I was the young man in the tomb and I'm going to tell you where it is. I think that's extraordinarily unlikely. What about the resurrection appearances? Well, again, we both agree that the disciples had these experiences. The question is, were they hallucinatory or not? And finally, fourth, the origin of the disciples' belief. Again, I think we've seen that the disciples' belief is extraordinary. It is un-Jewish. It can't be accounted for in light of prior Jewish influences, and therefore cries out for some sort of explanation. Now, the best explanation of these 4 facts, I submit, is the resurrection of Jesus. And basically, that's gone uncontested in tonight's debate. The only problem with believing in the resurrection is that it's miraculous, and that's going to hinge on whether or not you believe God exists. And if you have trouble with the resurrection, then you really need to re-explore whether or not there's good evidence to believe in God, and that's a debate for another evening. But what about the hallucination hypothesis? It has weak explanatory scope because it can't cover all the evidence. It has weak explanatory power in that it can't explain the diversity of the appearances. He says, well, sure it can, because the first was to Peter and the rest were a chain reaction. That's not true. The testimony of the New Testament is that the first appearance was to the women. Well, that's multiply independently attested. And that was prior to Peter's experience. Moreover, James doesn't stand in the chain because James was an unbeliever during his lifetime. Moreover, it's very difficult to explain how groups of people can have hallucinations repeatedly on different occasions. So I think this diversity is very, very difficult for the chain reaction hypothesis to account for. Moreover, it can't explain why they believed in the resurrection of Jesus rather than just his assumption into heaven. Finally, I think the theory is utterly implausible with respect to the depth psychology, the insufficient data, Paul's supposed guilt complex, and the reduction of all the appearances to mere visions. None of this, I think, really stands up the test of historical scrutiny. So I would like to just close by encouraging you to pick up a New Testament yourself and to begin to read it. Read the resurrection accounts in the Gospels. Read what the Bible has to say about this and ask yourself, could this really be the truth? Could Jesus really have risen from the dead? I think the historical evidence makes this hypothesis the best explanation of the data, and that means that Christ is alive today and can be known and experienced in our lives as well. Thank you.